Now, in your video, you claim that free markets have these contradictions in them, and then you list some of them. You keep saying that the system won't work because there are these contradictions, and when you list them, the things that you list aren't actually contradictions. Now, if they were true, we might say that they're problems, that they're difficult things in free markets. For instance, you say that they lead to monopolies and a concentration of wealth. Whether or not that's true or not, neither of those are contradictions. To say that free markets will lead to a monopoly is not a contradiction. Now, I think it's wrong. I don't think that there's any basis for you to conclude that, but for you to just call it a contradiction is wrong. I appreciate your appeal to Aristotelian logic here, because I believe in the law of identity as well. It's not just that something has a contradiction, it will be difficult or not very efficient. If something has a contradiction, then it's logically impossible. And so I appreciate that, but none of the things you listed are contradictions. Now, I will point out that the Venus Project and the Zeitgeist movement and all of the utopian socialist plans are themselves contradictions, because all of them claim to promise to give you things unconditionally. So whether you can work, whether you're lazy, whether whatever, you will be granted resources unconditionally. And this is impossible because for those resources to be produced and provided, somebody at some level of production needs to work. And so those people whose work and labor is required to provide the goods for others cannot unconditionally receive benefits, because for there to be any benefits, somebody has to, not maybe, might, could, has to work. And so for those people, the beneficence of the Zeitgeist movement or whatever is going to be conditional on their having to work. And so you can't say, well, my system is going to give to everybody regardless. No, your system is, at best, would have to give to everybody, but with some people being forced to provide it at some level. So there's that. The other problem is, I want to go through your contradictions. Now, I don't believe they're contradictions, but even if they're not, they could be problems, and so it's valid for you to point them out, and it's perfectly reasonable for you to expect somebody to perhaps refute or address the issues. And in this one, I'd like to talk about the wealth disparity. And Peter Schiff in his video said, well, we don't have free markets now, we don't have capitalism, we have cronyism, we have corporatism, we have a mixed economy. And so to attribute the concentration of wealth to capitalism is bogus. Now, your response to this is to just say, well, we have concentrations of wealth, and also to say at other points in history we've had concentrations of wealth. Hence, Peter Schiff is wrong. These concentrations of wealth surely must be the result of free markets. Now, here you have made the very common error of correlation, of equating correlation with causation. So to look at the United States, say, and leaving aside for the moment right now the fact that we don't have a free market, let's assume that while we have some degree of capitalism and we have some degree of government and socialism, which obviously we do. We have welfare, we have a socialized legal system, we have a socialized monetary system, we have a socialized military, we have all kinds of government regulations. So I think it's fair to say we have some socialism, we have some capitalism in the society, and as you pointed out, as everybody knows and no one denies, there's a high concentration of wealth. Now, the only argument you make, and this is something that I hear all the time, and as far as the argument goes, is, well, we have some capitalism, there is a disparity in wealth, hence it was the free market and capitalism that brought about this disparity of wealth. And again, you have made no analysis whatsoever as to why there is a concentration of wealth. And to show you how ridiculous this is, we could look at other examples and say, look at Tsarist Russia. And Tsar Nicholas II was reputed to be the third richest man, not in Russia, but in history, in all of human history, the third richest man. And you could look at that and you could say, look, at Tsarist Russia has a concentration of wealth, which it had a concentration of wealth far more dramatic than anything we have in the United States. If the United States has a pyramid with a few people at the top, and then a big base. Soviet Russia, or not Soviet Russia, Tsarist Russia is like a slab with a toothpick sticking up. You know, with a ton of people very poor, and then a very tiny population that's exceedingly wealthy. And you could look at Tsarist Russia and you could say, look, there's concentration of wealth, hence that was the free market capitalism that caused that. I mean, no. We could say that there's some private property in Tsarist Russia, that there's some semblance of a market in some areas, which of course there was, as there have always been, even in the most socialistic Marxist countries, there's been some things you could point to as being capitalist and free market and private property, and say, oh, that's the cause, when obviously that wasn't the cause. Obviously the fact that Tsar Nicholas II was the Tsar is the reason he was so rich, and it has nothing to do with free markets or capitalism. And that's hardly the only example I could pick. The Soviet Union would also fall into this category. Well known. The Soviet Union had poverty, the likes of which you and I basically cannot even imagine, and yet if you were in the Politburo, you would have a very nice dacha on the coast of the Black Sea, probably in the Ukraine. You drive around in a Rolls-Royce limousine and have all the amenities wealthy people in the West would have. You could say, look, there's a disparity of wealth in the Soviet Union. They have black markets. They have a certain degree of market economy, depending on what period of the Soviet Union you're talking about. And you could just say, oh, look, the disparity of wealth in the Soviet Union, it must be because of capitalism, free markets. And of course, that's absurd. And we could go on and on and on and on and on. So, I mean, in one of your comments to me, you said, analyze the disparity of wealth. Well, you gave no analysis of the disparity of wealth. You just cited that it's there and concluded that it must be from free markets and capitalism. I would beg to differ. We know for a fact that the government colludes with certain industries and certain actors in certain industries to their benefit. Industries go to the government and ask for regulations. It is a myth, a very widespread but completely ahistorical myth, that regulations are brought about by consumers going to the government and advocating that they introduce regulations. Occasionally consumers will attempt to do this, and usually they won't get anywhere. The only time it ever gets anywhere is when the industry comes and demands regulations. And industries don't demand regulations because they love their customers so much. It's because they want to get rid of their competition. And there are so many examples of government either completely outlawing or just greatly hampering certain industries to the benefit of some, that for you to then point to their accumulation of wealth and say, ah, free marketism, capitalism, when it was the government regulations that you laud and applaud and call for all the time, that you would yourself define as socialistic and anti-capitalist, well, then you're not really doing any analysis whatsoever. You have to get past this, oh look, there's a disparity of wealth, and it must have been caused by free markets. Now, one thing I always hear socialists say is how the disparity of wealth is growing, and as far as I can tell, this is true. Sometimes some of the numbers are a little misleading, but I would agree with that statement. But the government has grown enormously. Like, for some reason, there's this myth that the government has shrunk somehow. The government spending and the amount that it brings in has ever increased dramatically under Bush, under Obama, under Clinton, under every president. There's no president who left the government smaller than when he brought in, with the possible exception of someone like Truman or somebody who came in during a big war and left after the war. Other than that, it's never really happened. And I mean, if you look at the Federal Registry at the list of regulations, there's never been a year where it's gone down. You might say, well, this little regulation got changed, or this little regulation got changed, but for every one that got changed or eliminated, literally hundreds and hundreds, perhaps thousands, were added. They add thousands of pages of new regulations every year. And so just to pretend like we've been, I mean, if we're getting a higher concentration of wealth, but the government is growing, that's evidence, perhaps not proof, but evidence that the disparity of wealth can't really be attributed to a lack of government regulation of the economy, because the government regulation ever grows. So you're the one who needs to analyze the disparity of wealth. Now, if we want to go back to the progressive era, there's a couple things you say. Again, because one person accumulates wealth doesn't mean that they have done so at the expense of others. You say in your video, and I don't know if this is intentional or just a slip of your speech, but you say things like, all the wealth gets concentrated at the top. Of course, implied in that statement is that there's only a certain amount of wealth, but the whole point of an industrialist, of someone with a factory, is that you're creating wealth. You know, you're taking raw materials that are, as their constituent parts, only worth so much to people. You're combining them in such a way that the result is actually worth more than the constituent pulp. And I say worth not in monetary terms, although that's true as well, but worth in terms of just people's subjective value. So if you were to pile in front of me all the ingredients of a car, it would just be like a, you know, a couple feet high pile of raw material, rubber and aluminum and steel and copper and whatever, and I wouldn't be willing to pay $100 for it. But you go through and you arrange all that stuff into a car, and suddenly it's something I like. And if I pay for that car, it's not like the capitalist has stolen my wealth. He's created a car, we've exchanged for it. Wealth has increased because he's taken these natural materials and converted into them something that is more useful, based on the fact that people are willing to buy it. So you have implicit in all of this, and this is very common among socialists, this idea that there's only a set amount of wealth. If you see somebody who's rich, then you imagine that can only be at the expense of somebody else. And I will agree that often this is the case, that it is the expense, but that's never it's never because of free markets that that's the case. If the government goes and tells people that they have to buy insurance from an insurance company or else they'll go to jail, like Obama just did, or not just 2 years ago with his Obamacare, and the healthcare company, the insurance companies become wealthy because of this, because if people don't pay, the IRS will arrest them and throw them in prison, then it's perfectly legitimate to point out that accumulation of wealth and say that was exploitation. That did come at the expense of other people's well-being. But to just sell something to provide a good or service voluntarily doesn't work that way. Now, the second thing is you can point to the robber barons of the progressive. Well, I'm going to do the progressive era in another video, since you talk a little bit about it, and I would make this video a lot longer. So causation does not or correlation does not equal causation. You actually have to do some analysis yourself. I mean, there's every country in the world, even the most socialistic ones, have disparity in wealth, and actually the disparities are far worse. You look at a country like India or Mexico, they have large numbers of multi-billionaires, and yet hundreds of millions, in the case of India, in the case of Mexico, tens of millions of people who are absolutely impoverished. And neither of those countries are free markets in the least, and so they have some better explanation than the one that you're jumping to.